They didn't lower their voices, didn't wait for privacy. My CEO slammed a folder on the table, cut my salary, erased my title, and told the room I was no longer needed. The silence from the others hurt almost more than the words. 9 years of sacrifice wiped away like I was disposable. But what none of them knew, not even him, was that their decision had quietly unlocked something they never saw coming. If you're listening, tell me where you are right now, and subscribe for more stories like this. The slap of the folder hitting the conference table was so sharp, it felt like it cut straight through me. Mason Grant didn't even look up as he did it. He just let that sound, loud, intentional, humiliating, echo around the glass-walled executive boardroom while the senior leadership team sat frozen in their leather chairs. I stood at the far end of the table, hands clasped in front of me, trying to keep my pulse from rattling my ribs. The air system hummed faintly overhead, and for a moment it sounded like it was mocking me. Effective immediately, Skylar. Your role as Chief System Strategist is terminated. No hesitation, no explanation, just a clinical execution delivered with the cold precision of a man who wanted witnesses. A few executives shifted in their seats. I could practically hear their discomfort. No one made eye contact. I wasn't surprised. People who build things, who work late nights, who carry companies on their backs, those people make others uneasy when they fall. I felt every pair of eyes flick downward, pretending they hadn't heard what they just heard. Mason finally leaned back in his chair. Perfect charcoal suit, perfect tie, perfect expression of manufactured indifference. He didn't fire me because I'd failed. He fired me because I'd challenged him, because I'd questioned the spending blowouts he buried under strategic initiatives, because I refused to sign off on infrastructure changes that would have destabilized our entire platform. He wanted obedience, not expertise. And in this company, the person who pushes back always learns the price. I opened my mouth, not trusting myself to speak, half expecting my voice to break in front of them. But something steadier came out. Thank you. A few heads jerked up. Someone stopped breathing. Mason blinked just once like a man who thought he'd heard incorrectly. He expected me to fight, to beg, to shake. Instead, I stacked my notes quietly, slid them into my bag, and stayed perfectly, unnervingly calm. Because the moment those words left his mouth, the moment he stripped me of authority, Mason activated something he didn't know existed, something I'd buried years earlier in paperwork he'd never cared to read. But I didn't show that. Not yet. I walked towards the glass doors, each step controlled, heels clicking just loud enough to cut through the silence. My throat burned, but I refused to let anything show. Not here, not in front of people who'd watched me hold this company together through budget freezes, mass layoffs, and leadership overhauls while they collected bonuses. As I reached for the handle, Mason added, "Your access will be revoked by the end of the day. Leave your badge with security." His voice was triumphant, almost giddy. He thought this moment was his victory. I paused, just long enough for him to think I might say something, might break, might finally react. Then I walked out without giving him the satisfaction. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed and reflected off the polished floors. The building felt colder than it ever had. My badge still hung around my neck, warm against my skin from the heat of my body. And as the elevator doors opened, I whispered a truth so small, no one else heard it. You have no idea what you just did. When the elevator doors slid shut, the silence inside the metal box gave me a moment I hadn't had in years, a moment where nothing demanded my attention, no one needed an answer, and no system was alerting me about failures that only I knew how to fix. I leaned back, the cool wall pressing against my spine, and for the first time since Mason slammed that folder on the table, the weight of everything I'd given this place hit me all at once. 9 years of carrying an entire infrastructure that should have required 3 teams. 9 years of being the first one in the building and the last one to leave. 9 years of skipping dinners, missing birthdays, canceling plans, telling my mother just 1 more quarter when she asked me to come home. People like Mason never understood the cost of the stability they bragged about in interviews. They never saw what it took to hold together a system that was patched, rewired, reimagined, and resurrected more times than I could count. They only saw a steady dashboard and assumed it meant the work was effortless. It wasn't. It was my life. The signs that something was shifting began quietly, almost politely. Meetings I used to lead were suddenly reassigned. Architecture discussions happened without my input. Junior engineers stopped copying me on threads where decisions were made about systems I personally built. Must have been an oversight, they'd say, smiling too quickly. It wasn't. Oversights don't happen 4 times in a week. I'd sit in the back of those conference rooms watching Mason charm the room with buzzwords he barely understood. Modernize, streamline, next gen. And I could feel the ground shifting under me. He didn't know the technology. He didn't want to. What he wanted was control. And people like me, people who know where the real bones of the system are buried, who know how things actually work, who know what happens when the shiny corporate facade cracks. We are threats to men like him. They don't fix foundations, they paint over them. And every time I questioned a risky choice, every time I pointed out something he didn't want to hear, I watched his smile tighten just a little more. The turning point came the night Apex Dynamics announced it was cutting infrastructure development by 55%. The company panicked, people scrambled, and in the chaos, I saw something everyone else missed. Mason was planning a leadership consolidation. He wanted to strip down teams, reduce oversight, and push through changes without resistance. And that meant silencing me. That night, while everyone else was trying to protect their jobs, I pulled out contracts, licensing agreements, and architecture frameworks I hadn't touched in years. I didn't trust Mason then. Not with the system, not with my team, not with the future of what we built. I didn't know when the hammer would fall, only that it eventually would. So I took the only precaution I had. I built in protections that didn't rely on trust. I buried them in the paperwork. I documented every line of authorship. I filed ownership under a structure no one cared enough to examine. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd learned the oldest truth in corporate life. If you don't protect the house you built, someone else will burn it down and blame you for the ashes. I didn't cry when I stepped out of the building. I thought I might. After everything that had just happened, after the humiliation, after the silence from people who'd once claimed they couldn't run the place without me, you'd think tears would have come naturally, but they didn't. Instead, I walked to my car with a strange, steady calm, like my body already knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. It wasn't until I reached my apartment, still dark, still cluttered with half-finished diagrams and empty coffee cups, that the numbness cracked. The door shut behind me with a hollow thud, the kind that always made the air seem heavier. I dropped my bag on the kitchen counter and stood there, palms pressed against the cool surface, letting the quiet settle around me. No notifications, no 2 a.m. alerts, no urgent pings from junior engineers begging, "Skylar, can you take a look?" For the first time in nearly a decade, I had silence, and oddly, that hurt more than the firing. I walked to the dining table, though at this point it hadn't seen an actual meal in years, and stared at the stacks of documents spread out across it. My entire professional life was piled there. Architecture drafts, compliance reports, contract appendices. I sank into my chair and reached for the oldest box, the one I hadn't opened since the infrastructure cuts 3 years ago. Back then, while everyone was panicking about layoffs and reorg charts, I'd spent nights combing through contracts because I could feel something shifting. I didn't know what form the threat would take, only that it was coming. And tonight, as I dug through those papers, I found the page I'd almost convinced myself I imagined. Paragraph wasn't long. It didn't look dramatic. It was buried deep in an appendix under a section Mason never would have read, even if someone had paid him. But as my eyes landed on those lines, something hot and electric pulsed through me. In the event of removal of principal systems oversight or termination of lead architect duties, all operational authority, authentication rights, and system ownership transferred to the originating architect of record. My signature, their signatures, 3 witnesses, notarized, completely valid. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with an overwhelming rush of relief and vindication. The very moment Mason fired me, he triggered a transfer of control he didn't even know existed. The keys he thought he owned? The system he bragged about modernizing? The architecture he tried to reshape without understanding the first layer of it? All of it reverted to me the instant he cut me loose. They didn't read the fine print. They never do. People like Mason assume the builders, the ones writing code at midnight, the ones solving crises while executives sleep, don't know how to protect themselves. They assume loyalty means obedience. They assume silence means weakness. They assume firing us is the end. It never is. I leaned back in my chair, the contract still open in front of me, and whispered into the empty room. You have no idea what you've started. 13 days after Mason fired me, the sun rose over Denver like it had no idea the city was about to witness a collapse broadcast to half the industry. I sat in my apartment with a cup of coffee that had gone cold twice already, my laptop open on the counter. They still hadn't revoked my access to Apex's internal channels. Maybe it was incompetence. Maybe they thought I wouldn't matter anymore. Maybe they didn't want to draw attention to the fact that the person who built their entire infrastructure had been tossed out like a defective part. Whatever the reason, I watched everything unfold in real time. Apex Dynamics had been hyping this event for weeks, their big national rollout, the demonstration of the rebuilt system Mason kept bragging about on every podcast desperate enough to host him. The auditorium live stream flickered to life on my screen. Rows of investors sat neatly aligned, suits stiff, notebooks ready, expressions carved into expectation. The kind of audience that feeds on momentum and punishes doubt. When Mason walked onto the stage, he did it like he thought the cameras existed just for him. Perfect suit, perfect lighting, perfect smile stretched a little too tight. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, arms open like a preacher addressing his flock. Today you witness the future of scalable infrastructure. This is Apex's breakthrough, our new system, engineered to be faster, safer, and more adaptable than anything on the market. My jaw twitched. He said engineered, but he hadn't engineered a thing in his life. The real engineers, the ones he ignored, dismissed, and steamrolled, were off camera scrambling in the control booth. The system on display wasn't new. It was my architecture, with pieces ripped out, repainted, and forced into a presentation Mason barely understood. The feed switched to a massive screen behind him as he gestured grandly. Let's begin the live demonstration. Investors leaned forward. The room buzzed with anticipation. Back on my laptop, internal Slack channels lit up. Avery, running final checks now. Jonah, production servers stable. Tessa, keys validated yesterday, we should be all green. I stared at those messages, feeling a hollow ache settle in my chest. They had no idea what was coming. They didn't know that the moment Mason cut me from the company, he also cut every valid authentication pathway Apex relied on. The system they were about to present needed a master key, one they assumed was still theirs, one they didn't realize had transferred to me the moment he terminated my oversight. On stage, the dashboard animation loaded. Code scrolled in elegant patterns across the massive screen, a crowd-pleasing visual meant to impress people who didn't understand any of it. Then, mid-scroll, the screen froze. Not a flicker, not a stall, utter perfect stillness. Then a single line of text appeared, white letters on a black screen, stark and clinical. Authorization expired, system access denied. The room went silent in a way silence isn't supposed to happen, with a heaviness that sucked all movement out of the air. Mason blinked, laughed nervously. A minor technical delay. We'll have this resolved in 2 minutes. Investors shifted. 2 minutes passed. Nothing changed. 5 minutes. No movement. The camera cut to the engineering booth. I could see Avery and Jonah frantically typing, heads shaking, panic spreading through their posture. Internal Slack exploded. Avery, master credentials failing. Jonah, production key invalid? Tessa, someone changed access, that's impossible. And then Jonah again. Skylar, you were the originating architect, Does that mean I didn't type anything? I just sat back and watched as the auditorium transformed from impatient to irritated to furious. 10 minutes in, investors began whispering sharply to each other. 15 minutes. People stood up, gathering their things. One woman slammed her notebook shut so loudly the microphones picked it up. Then came the question that detonated the room. Are you saying, an investor called out, you've lost control of your own system? Mason's face drained so visibly the camera caught it. Of course not, he stammered. We have redundancies, backups, this is just. His voice cracked. The audience uproared. People demanded answers. Reporters sprang up from their seats. The live stream chat exploded into a firestorm of question marks and disbelief. My system, the one they thought they owned, refused every command they gave it. They had spent 13 days pretending I was irrelevant, and in 13 minutes, the truth revealed itself in front of every investor they depended on. I didn't smile, but the grip in my chest loosened for the first time since the day Mason slammed that folder on the table. He wanted the world to see me as disposable. Instead, the world was watching him lose everything he thought he controlled. The morning after the meltdown, Denver felt different. Even through my apartment windows, I could sense a shift in the air, like the city itself knew something enormous had cracked open. I sat at my table staring at 3 separate news streams playing simultaneously on my laptop. Every headline screamed the same message. Apex Dynamics had publicly face-planted on the biggest stage of its existence. Overnight, the company that once bragged about unshakable stability had become a cautionary tale. Tech outlets replayed the clip of Mason standing frozen on stage like a man watching his reflection fall apart. Analysts broke down the failure frame by frame, trying to understand how a company with 9 years of flawless uptime could suddenly lose control of its own platform. They guessed server failures, software bugs, vendor outages. None of them came close. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages from old coworkers, friends, even people I hadn't spoken to since college. But the ones that mattered came from the people still trapped inside Apex's sinking ship. Avery, we're being told to rebuild the entire infrastructure in 5 days. 5. Tessa, they want us to recreate what took you 9 years to stabilize. Jonah, I don't know how to tell them this can't be done. I stared at their messages, anger and sorrow twisting together inside my chest. They didn't deserve any of this. They were good people, talented, loyal, and overworked in ways Mason never bothered to understand. Before I could respond, a notification flashed. Direct message from Reed. Seeing his name carved a cold line down my spine. Reed had once been the person I trusted most. My deputy, the one who sat beside me during 2 a.m. outages, drinking terrible vending machine coffee and swearing we'd both quit after the next crisis, the one I thought would take care of the team if anything ever happened to me. His message popped up in sharp, clipped sentences. Skylar, we both know you still have control of the system. The board is in chaos. Investors want answers. And Apex cannot function like this. Whatever clause you buried, it's time to hand it back. I didn't reply. My hands hovered over the keyboard, then fell still. Another message came instantly. This isn't protecting the company, this is holding it hostage. The words hit harder than I expected. Hostage. It was exactly the narrative Mason needed, painting me as the villain so no one looked too closely at his incompetence. Then came the betrayal I hadn't anticipated. I'm working with Mason to regain full access. We'll override whatever locks you put in. I felt it in my chest like a sudden bruise. Reed chose him, chose power, chose proximity to leadership over loyalty to the person who'd taught him half of what he knew. For a moment I couldn't breathe, not because I feared he could break my safeguards. He couldn't. I coded those layers with too much precision, too much foresight, too much understanding of how Apex would eventually turn on its builders. But the emotional weight, the realization that someone I believed would stand by me had switched sides without hesitation, that was something no legal clause could protect against. On my laptop, another alert blinked. Unauthorized access attempt detected. User privileges suspended. Reed had tried to circumvent the system, 10 failed attempts in under an hour. He attacked the architecture like it was a puzzle he could brute force with enough desperation, but he never understood the core of it. He knew the how. He never understood the why. I closed the laptop with a soft thud and sat back, staring at the ceiling. Outside, headlights streaked across the street as the city moved on, unaware that a multi-billion-dollar company was unraveling in real time. They would blame me. Mason would make sure of it. The board would pretend ignorance. Investors would scream for blood. And through it all, the engineers I cared about were suffocating under impossible demands. I wasn't the villain in this story, but I was done letting villains write it. 3 days after the second collapse, the email arrived like a final admission of defeat. A single line from Apex's legal counsel. The board requests an immediate meeting, in person. No threats this time, no demands, no posturing, just panic wrapped in corporate formality. I drove to the headquarters in a silence so thick it felt fragile, like any loud thought might shatter it. The building looked different now. Not physically. Same glass, same steel, but the energy had changed. Employees hurried past without meeting anyone's eyes. Conversations were hushed. The aura of invincibility Apex once carried had evaporated. The receptionist, who once required 3 levels of approval to let anyone through, simply nodded and waved me up, as if she'd been waiting for me. When I stepped into the boardroom, the same one where Mason had humiliated me, the shift in power was instant and unmistakable. No folder slap, no smirks, just silence. 7 board members sat rigidly in their chairs, faces tight, eyes desperate in a way men of their status rarely allow themselves to be seen. Mason stood off to the side now, not at the head of the table. His posture had collapsed into something brittle and defensive, as if he was afraid to breathe too loudly. He didn't control this room anymore. The board chair cleared his throat. "Skylar, we made a grave mistake." The words hung there, heavy and overdue. Another director leaned forward. "We're prepared to offer reinstatement at a higher level, full authority over systems, triple your previous compensation, unlimited budget, whatever you need." Whatever I need. The same people who once treated me like a replaceable technician were now offering me the kingdom. I said nothing. Mason broke first. "You're rewarding her?" he snapped, voice cracking with disbelief. "She crippled us. She designed this trap." I finally turned my eyes on him calmly, without heat. "You triggered a contract you didn't bother to read. You locked yourself out of a system you never tried to understand." His jaw twitched, but he said nothing more. The board chair exhaled shakily. "Name your terms, Skylar. We can fix this together." There it was, their final bargaining chip, an appeal to shared purpose. But there was no together here, not anymore. I gathered the contract I'd brought, closed the folder, and let the silence speak for a long beat before answering. "You can't fix what rotted from the inside," I said quietly, "and you can't buy back integrity after you throw it out." Chairs shifted, breath caught. Someone whispered, "Please." I stood, smoothing the front of my jacket. "You didn't lose control because of me. You lost it when you let someone like him lead." I walked to the door without looking back. The moment it closed behind me, the shouting erupted. I didn't stop. I had finally taken back what mattered: my dignity, my work, and my story. 2 days after I walked out of that boardroom for the last time, I received an email that didn't look like a corporate summons, a threat, or a plea. No legal jargon, no desperation disguised as professionalism, just a simple subject line. Coffee? It was from Callum Rivers, the founder of Helix Terra Systems, Apex's rival, the one Mason mocked constantly in meetings because he was terrified of how quickly they were catching up. Callum wasn't a showman. He wasn't the type who needed cameras or flashy statements. He was an engineer first, a leader second, and a businessman only because someone had to keep the lights on. We met at a small cafe near Union Station, the kind of place where people brought laptops and dreams. He sat across from me with no entourage, no pitch deck, no ego. "I've watched what Apex did to you," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "And I've watched what you built. I think it deserves a future that isn't dictated by executives who don't understand it." He slid his tablet across the table. My eyes landed on the document open on the screen. Acquisition proposal, Skylar Dane's infrastructure engine, $1.4 billion. My breath caught, not for the number, but for the clarity. He wasn't buying a trophy. He wasn't trying to steal revenge. He wanted the system to survive. Callum tapped the corner of the tablet. "I know you won't say yes unless your team comes with you, so I've already drafted their offers. Full autonomy, better pay, no more overnight emergencies unless they choose them." I didn't answer right away. I thought of Avery's frantic messages, Jonah's exhaustion, Tessa's fear. They'd given everything to Apex, only to watch leadership set it all on fire. "If they agree," I said quietly, "so do I." They agreed within an hour, not because of the money, but because they finally felt seen. 2 days later, we signed the deal in a sunlit corner office overlooking the trains pulling in and out of the station. I felt something warm in my chest, something like pride, something like relief, something I hadn't felt in years. When the news broke, headlines spread like wildfire. Apex's former architect sells engine to competitor for 1.4 billion. Helix Terra gains massive advantage after strategic acquisition. Apex collapses under failed leadership. Reporters called. Old colleagues texted. My sister cried on the phone. My mother whispered, "I knew they'd regret underestimating you." I stood by the window of my new office, watching the city move below me, every street humming with possibility. This wasn't revenge, not really. It was reclamation. It was choosing my worth over their blindness. It was taking back what I built and placing it where it could grow instead of decay under arrogance. Apex lost everything in 13 days. I gained everything I'd spent 9 years fighting for. And as I looked out at the Denver skyline, one truth settled in my bones. They didn't erase me. They freed me. I didn't realize how much quiet strength I'd been building until everything fell apart at once. It's strange. People assume power comes from titles, corner offices, or the ability to raise your voice in a crowded room. Mine came from something smaller, slower, and far less glamorous. The discipline to document, to prepare, to understand the work so deeply that no one could twist it away from me. When Mason fired me, I felt the shock in my bones. But underneath the embarrassment, underneath the sting of being dismissed in front of a room full of people who once depended on me, there was something steadier. A foundation I had poured over years, line by line, signature by signature, safeguard by safeguard. That hidden strength didn't erase the pain. It didn't erase the long nights or the years I spent convincing myself loyalty would be rewarded. But it reminded me that I wasn't powerless, even when they wanted me to believe I was. People like Mason rise quickly because they confuse confidence with competence. People like me survive because we understand what holds everything together. And sometimes, that quiet understanding becomes the very thing that changes everything. If there's anything I'd tell someone who feels overlooked or underestimated, it's this. Preparation is a form of power, not loud, not flashy, but unshakable. When the world tries to erase you, the work you documented, protected, and built with integrity becomes your defense and your leverage. How to get started today. Write things down: dates, decisions, contributions, ownership. Save copies of agreements before you sign them. Build systems that make sense even if someone else takes over. Assume leadership won't protect you. Protect yourself. Prepare quietly, consistently without announcing it. What part of this experience reminded you of something from your own workplace?